Today is September the 24th, 2021. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and today Larry Caldwell, retiree of NRCS, and we are in Shawnee, Oklahoma to interview Bill Wilson about his conservation activities through the years. In 2012, Oklahoma's Conservation Partnership honored Bill for his service and leadership to the cause of conservation at local, state, and national levels. He served on the Haskell County Conservation District Board of Directors for 32 years. I've got the dates as 1980 through 2012, and then was president of both the Oklahoma and the National Association of Conservation Districts, and was a founding member of the National Watershed Coalition. All those right?
They're right.
Those are right. Mm-hmm. And in 2001 was inducted into the Oklahoma Conservation Hall of Fame. Okay. This interview will be part of our Oklahoma's Conservation Heritage Oral History Project, which is a collaboration between the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. So thank you for talking with us today. Before we get into conservation, let's learn a little bit about you. Start wherever you like.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to do this. It's exciting, and I'm proud to be a part of hopefully the preservation of history of not only conservation but of Oklahoma as well. So I'd like to start, and I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, but I'd like to start with my family before they came to Oklahoma. Okay. And we'll start during the Civil War. And my great-grandfather was in Birmingham, Alabama, or in that area. And of course he was fought in the war for the South, and I don't know if he was conscripted or what the deal was at that time, but anyway, he was there, and when the war ended, he'd been gone a number of years, and the family hadn't even heard from him, and he walked up on the front porch one day, and for some reason he had lost a button off his coat, and he had sewn a button on that coat that was larger than the original buttons, and my granddad, his son, was the only one that recognized him, and he said, "Well, hello there, big button," and but anyway, he was a minister, a Baptist Methodist minister is what his license says, and during that time, and of course before the Civil War, the removal of the Indians to the nations here in Oklahoma began, but most people think that the Trail of Tears or that removal was real short, but it took decades to move those Indians from the eastern states to Oklahoma. And after the war, he had freight wagons, and so he made about 3 trips from Alabama to the Choctaw Nation, helping move Indians and their families and their belongings into the nation. And as a result of that, and on the last trip, he brought his family with him. And as a result of that, he had permission to come into the Choctaw Nation. Of course, this was in the 1890s. So there were a lot of people, if you remember the Judge Parker story, there were a lot of outlaws and people here that weren't invited or weren't supposed to be here, but he and his family were, and there were a number of white families here in the nation, but the Indian Department at that time, it's BIA, now Bureau of Indian Affairs, had built schools for the Indian kids, but the white people that were living in the nation couldn't go to those schools, so they had to provide their own schools, their own buildings, and their own teachers, and so they built a little building just northwest of Worcester in LaFleur County, and they had school in that building during the week, and then on Sunday morning he preached there. And I have a picture that he took of the family and the congregation in 1903 in front of that building. And a number of years ago, my cousin and I went back to that location. The building was gone. There's some of the stones there that had been the foundation, but there was a tree in that picture, and that tree was still there. And I got a picture of that tree. So trying to preserve history. And that's kind of how my dad's family came in to Oklahoma and to the nation.
And what was his name before you go on?
My dad was Ed Wilson, and John Mart was my grandfather, and John Henderson Wilson was my great-grandfather,
Okay.
the one that was in the Civil War. And we'll skip to my mother's side, and then we'll bring them all together here in a minute. But
Okay.
my mother's family, their name was Martin, and they were in northern Middle Tennessee. And my grandfather and Martin and his brother were hearing about the land in the West that could be homesteaded, and so they sold all their farming equipment and bought train tickets and took the family to New Mexico on the high plains southeast of Albuquerque, up out of the valley there, and homesteaded a quarter section each. And that's where my mother was born. They built a soddy house there on that quarter section, and she was born there in 1913. And he didn't, being from northern Middle Tennessee where it actually rained, he was not familiar with New Mexico. So as soon as he got his patent approved, and I have a copy of his patent, he sold that property to some people that were there, and he didn't have enough money, he said, to buy train tickets to go back to Tennessee. So they loaded in 2 covered wagons and started back to Tennessee. And they got to eastern Oklahoma, and there's a place called Caston Creek, and there's a watershed structure there on Caston Mountain Creek now. But when he got there, the creek was flooded and he couldn't get across, so they camped there on the creek bank, and the man that owned the land there was wanting to sell it. So my granddad wound up buying that land and spent the rest of his life there. And so that's kind of, their name was Martin, and that's kind of the way my family. One of my ancestors was the first Chief Justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court when the Cherokee tribe moved to Oklahoma and set up their government in Tahlequah. He was the first Chief Justice. His name was John Martin, Judge John Martin. He's buried in Fort Gibson now. And but anyway, that kind of brings you to where the families came from and how they got into Oklahoma. And of course, my dad, and I've always really been proud of him because they lived in an area where they couldn't go to school when he was little, and he didn't get to start school till he was 10 years old. And they had lived back in the mountains there, and he had 3 sisters older than him and a brother older than him, and none of those kids got to go to school until they moved out to a place where there was a school. And Dad was 10 years old, and when he was 16 years old, he finished the 6th grade at a place called Hughes, Oklahoma. The old building is partially still there. And then they moved over into the Holston Valley and logging woods and started logging. And Dad, being 16 years old, was old enough to go to work and as an adult, and he drove mules and skidded logs and worked in the timber industry. And while he was there, he met and married a lady, and they had a baby, and she was born in 1928, and my older sister. And then Dad and her mother divorced, and Dad got custody of her, and they went from there. Well, in 29, we know what happened. The stock market crashed and the timber company went out of business, and so they lost their jobs, and they went to the Texas Panhandle and worked in farm fields for a while, a few years, and then they moved back to where I live now in eastern Oklahoma, and sharecrop property that I own now. They didn't own it, but I do now. And that's where they lived until my granddad's health failed, and then he moved back to Worcester in a house in town, and then died a couple of years after that. But my dad and my sister, his daughter, stayed there at Kenna, and Dad got a job, in addition to the farming he was doing, he got a job as the night watchman in the town of Kenna, kind of like a police chief, but he just was there during the night, and watched the businesses. I don't think the city paid him. I think the businesses actually paid him, but he had that job, and my sister went to school, and World War II came along, and he was 35 years old, and he volunteered to go into the Navy, and when he did, he took my sister to her mother, who was living in Illinois at the time, and so she spent the rest of her young life and then got married and lived the rest of her life in Illinois. But anyway, Dad went into the Navy, and I've always been proud of the fact that he had a 6th grade education, and he was in Naval Intelligence in San Diego. He never did go overseas. He was in San Diego, but during the time he was there, he had heart trouble, and he had I don't know if he had a heart attack. At that time, they called it hardening of the arteries, so it was different than it is today, but it was a weak heart. And he spent several months in the hospital, and he was discharged before the war ended. And I've always said that I was the original baby boomer, because my dad came home before all the other guys did and got married, and I was born before the rest. But actually, I think they actually gave that title to a lady that lived up in Michigan or somewhere, but I think I beat her. I think I was ahead of her. But anyway, that kind of brings us up to the family. And of course, right after World War II, Dad came home, and my mother had worked for Douglas Aircraft in Oklahoma City during the war, and she went back. They lived at Worcester, and they met and married, and then I was born right after that. And then when I was 2 years old, we moved. Well, Dad was always in the cattle business and raised cattle, and he usually grazed them on open range. And at that time, in the area where he lived, the open range was in the Poteau River Valley, and where the Poteau River is. And in 1948, they built a dam at Worcester Lake Dam, the Corps of Engineers, and they closed the gates and flooded that land, and so there was no more open range, no more grazing, so he sold that place and moved where we live now, and still raise cattle, but he bought 80 acres, which my brother still owns, and it joined the open range there south between Kenna and Wilburton in the Sandboy Mountains, and so he raised his cattle and grazed them in those mountains. And I was the oldest one of the 4 children. Dad and Mother had 4 children. I was the oldest, and so I got to go with Dad every day to check the cows horseback, and we'd leave before daylight, and sometimes we'd get home by 3 o'clock, and sometimes we'd stay all night because we had a cabin that we could stay in if we had to, but we had to watch those cows real close and check them. They were having calves in the spring, and screw arms were an issue, and we had to find every baby calf and doctor it before the screw arms would get to it. But anyway, that was the way I was raised, was riding horseback and checking cattle. And the open range then was pretty much inaccessible except by horseback. There were a few old logging roads. They'd done some timber work, forestry work in the 30s, but this was of course, obviously in the 50s, and so it was pretty much inaccessible except by horseback. But our land joined that, so in the summer we could put our cattle out in that open range and not have to provide pasture for them. We could run more cows that way. And but Dad bought that 80 acres in 1949 for $10 an acre, $800, and it had a barn on it, but it didn't have a house. So my granddad was a carpenter, and he had another relative, a cousin that was a carpenter, and they built us a 2-room house, and that's what we lived in. But the rural electric co-ops were just coming in at that time, and our house was the first house in that whole area that was actually wired for electricity when it was built. All the other houses, they'd had to wire them after as an add-on. And So that was kind of unique for us in the fact that we were the first, or had built the first house that actually was wired. The wiring was put in. I think we had one receptacle and one light fixture in each room, but the wiring was put in when the house was built. So
How about indoor plumbing?
no indoor plumbing, and actually we didn't even have a pump in the well. We drew water by hand, and Dad always had 5 or 6 big old sows. In the summertime, it was my job to draw water and keep not only their drinking water, but a wallet for them to stay cool in. And that's a pretty good job when you draw that by hand and carry it in buckets and pour it in that wallet. But kept the sows alive, and we always butchered hogs in the fall. Dad had cattle, but he was disabled, and he did have a disability compensation from the military, but he was not physically able to do a lot of work. So we just ran cattle. We didn't do any crop farming or anything like that, and so we sold all the cattle basically to make ends meet, and so we butchered hogs, and we ate a lot of pork, and we ate a lot of squirrels and wild game too in those years. But it was a good life. Later we got indoor plumbing in the house, but that was after my dad had passed away. My dad, I told you, he had heart problems when he was in the Navy, and he passed away at 57 years old, so he was pretty young. And then my mother had to go to work. She went to work at the school in the cafeteria, and that was about the same time that I was in college then, and had gone to Oklahoma City and working for a surveying company out of Oklahoma City in primarily the oil and gas industry, and I was actually living in an apartment in Alva, Oklahoma, the summer when my dad died in 1965. But like I say, Dad passed away at a fairly young age, and this year his birthday is September 11th, and this year he has been dead 57 years, so he was 57 years old when he passed away, and as this year has been gone 57 years. So I thought that was kind of special, I guess. But
so what year were you born then?
1946.
46. Okay. So 11. You were 11 when he passed away?
No.
21.
I was
21.
Actually, I think I was 19 when he passed away.
Okay.
In 1965.
Do my math, yes. That's right.
I was, like I say, I had graduated high school, and I had
from where?
From Kenta, which is where I live now. But
and what year did you graduate?
1965.
65. Okay.
And, I went to Eastern Oklahoma A&M at the time, and I wanted to be a land surveyor. I had an opportunity to work with a land surveyor. He had come over, and he was doing oil and gas exploration work, and at that time they had started exploring. They had some leases on that open range land I was talking about, and he was trying to get access to where he needed to go set a well location, and somebody told him that my dad was the one that he needed to talk to, so he came to our house, and Dad said, yes, said, I can take you, but said, we need to go tomorrow morning because it's all-day trip, and Dad had a Jeep by that time that he could drive, and he'd gotten to where he couldn't ride a horse, so he usually drove a Jeep. So anyway, when the guy came back the next morning, and he asked Dad that evening, he said, well, I'm going to need somebody to help me, and I think I was 13 years old, and Dad said, well, how about that boy there? Of course, I was pretty good, big for my age. And he said, well, yeah, that'll work. He asked me, he said, do you have a friend that you can get? And I said, yeah. So I got another one of my friends, and we went and helped him do that survey for about 3 days. And after that, I guess I fell in love with surveying. So I decided that I wanted to be a surveyor. And at that time, and even today, there really isn't any surveying programs available at the universities or colleges in Oklahoma. There is OSU has it's more of an engineering technology program at a couple of places. But anyway, I went to Eastern and got an associate degree in engineering. And the Vietnam War was raging along about that time. And of course, when school was out in May, I went to Oklahoma City and was working for the company out there. And my plans were to go to OSU that fall and in engineering, because I couldn't get surveying, but I could be a civil engineer, and with an emphasis in surveying. But I didn't enroll until early August or sometime in August because I was working. And the draft board, after I got home from enrolling, the draft board sent me a notice that they wanted to talk to me. And so I went over and talked to them, and I said, well, I'm enrolled at OSU. And they said, well, we didn't have a record of that because I hadn't enrolled early. And the fellow at the draft board said, well, I can probably get you out. But he said, my quota's going up every month. And he said, I'm probably going to have to start taking guys out of college to fill my quota on the draft. So he kind of talked me into just going ahead and going to the military instead of. So I went up and withdrew my enrollment from OSU and did go into the Army and spent 2 years and got married while I was in the Army, and married a girl that I had met in the company in Oklahoma City. And of course, I was in the construction engineers in the military. I did it really wasn't in, the infantry or the cavalry or anything like that. Fortunately, my degree had helped me there, and we actually. I spent a good bit of time in Southeast Asia, a good bit of it on the island of Okinawa in Japan, and then some in Thailand. We built a highway in Thailand to haul munitions in to an air base so they could bomb North Korea. And but anyway, I came home after that, and my wife had rented a house in Oklahoma City, and we started our life together. And I was working for the company that I'd worked for, and Diamond Chemical Company and Shamrock Oil Company had merged, and Shamrock had a refinery in Dumas, Texas, and Diamond Chemical had a plant somewhere in New Jersey, and they were needing the products from that refinery in that plant in New Jersey. So they decided to build a pipeline from Dumas, Texas to the Houston Ship Channel. So they hired us to do that survey. So we worked on that 600 miles of pipeline for 5 or 6 years, I guess. But during that time, toward the end of that time, I was able to buy 80 acres back at home where I was raised, and we still live there in that house. And we've bought more land that joins that. But this took longer than I intended for it, my background, but it talks about a lot about where I came from and kind of what formed my values, I guess. And
so what year did you move to Canada then?
1969, the day before Thanksgiving in 1969.
And that's where you've lived ever since?
Yeah. And, but anyway, so a little bit about the state of Oklahoma and its uniqueness in this country and the Western movement. It was designated in the treaties to be the Indian Territory, and they moved the tribes. The tribes agreed, and the last principal chief before the statehood was Green McCurtain. And his house is probably about 3 miles from where I live now. And he's buried in the same cemetery where my mother and father are buried. And then, of course, the Cherokees came from they came from North Carolina. And my grandmother was Cherokee. And but she was never actually part of the Trail of Tears, as we think of it. She actually married a white man in North Carolina, and they started working their way west. And he was working on a railroad, and then they were in Missouri, and she got sick that winter, and they had 4 children by that time, and she passed away. And so then he remarried and had another family. But my grandmother, and she had 3 brothers that were the Indians, and they pretty much stayed close to each other until they passed away. And
Are they in Missouri or Oklahoma?
They moved on to Oklahoma after she passed away. And he married this other lady, and they moved on to Oklahoma. And it says a lot about in my profession, Oklahoma being the Indian Territory. It was never intended, and at that time the General Land Office was doing surveys all over the western, the Louisiana Purchase and all the western states, so they could get the land ready to either sell it or patent it, to people in the western movement. Oklahoma was bypassed in the surveys. They was never intended to do any surveying. It was going to be tribal land, and which it still is, but they discovered oil in Oklahoma, and the oil companies were struggling with how to decide who owned this lease and who owned that lease and how much acreage was here, and they didn't have any surveys to base that on. So they got a senator named Dawes to set up a commission, and they built a building in Muskogee. The building is still there, and called the Dawes Commission, and they got the Congress to agree to do surveys in the Indian Territory, which was a violation of the treaties. But they went to the General Land Office and asked them if they would provide the surveyors to do that, and they said no, that's a violation of the treaties and we won't violate the law. So they went to the U.S. Geological Survey, which was a new agency at that time, and they said, well, sure, we'll do it. So they hired the same U.S. surveyors and U.S. deputy surveyors that the General Land Office used, but that's how the surveys got done in the Indian Territory. Now, the Oklahoma Territory was done 20 or 30 years earlier than that. And so that's how the surveys got done, and the oil companies were happy. They could keep each other somewhat honest, I guess. And then, as you know, in 1907, it became a state, and the Indian Territory and the Oklahoma Territory had a wedding, I guess, or whatever the celebration was, and Oklahoma became a state, which was another violation of the treaties. Wasn't ever supposed to happen, but about that time, the Indians, the tribes had gotten so weak that they didn't have a lot of influence, and the Bureau, or the Indian Department, they called it at that time, in the federal government, didn't really represent the tribes, I don't think, as well as they were supposed to do. So anyway, we are the state of Oklahoma, and we're still wrestling with the Supreme Court on what that means. But anyway, after we moved back to where we live now and bought that land, one of the first things I wanted to do was to improve the pastures and the grazing, so I started working with the local conservation district, and they had some equipment, and they had one part-time employee and a secretary that was half-time NRCS or SCS at the time, and half-time district, and they had a place where they could provide Bermuda sprigs for pasture improvement, but I had to go and use their equipment and harvest my own sprigs and take them and put them on my pasture and did all that. And at that time, I was, well, in high school, I had been active in FFA, and when I got out of high school and in some of those years that I'm talking about, I got active in the Oklahoma Young Farmers Association, which was kind of an extension of FFA. It was managed through the same Department of Vocational Education, which was in Stillwater at that time, and still is, I guess. But anyway, we got involved in that, and I was an officer for a number of years and was state president of the Oklahoma Young Farmers Association. And then each year we'd have a national meeting, and some state would kind of volunteer to be the host of that meeting, and so we did that, and we had that national meeting in Oklahoma City, and I was on that officer team of the national group. And
What year would that be?
I told you I couldn't remember the years very well, but it would have been in the early 70s.
70s.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was after we moved back to Kenna, so it was 74 or 5, somewhere in there. And then there was a fellow on the local conservation district board that had been on there a number of years, and he decided that he wanted to get off the board, and so the district conservationist at the time came to me, and at the board's request, I'm sure, and asked if I would be willing to serve on that board. And of course I didn't know how to say no, so I said yes. And 32 years later, I finally figured out that I probably needed to move on and do something else. But it was a good 32 years, and we did a lot of good work. Rural development.
Were you director during those at some point for those whole 32 years, or just on the board?
Well, I was a board member, yeah, director. That's what we call them, conservation district directors.
Well, I thought that was just one, but it's the whole board. It's everybody on the board's a director?
Yeah.
Wow, I learned something today then.
Yeah.
Okay.
We didn't have a district manager, so to speak, and that came later on. We started hiring, some districts hired district managers, but when I first went on the board, we had 5 board members and a secretary, which was half salary by NRSCS and half by the district or the Conservation Commission was the one that provided that. And then we had what we called an equipment manager. He worked for the district, but he mainly just managed the equipment and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, that was kind of when I got started in conservation, and rural development became kind of a buzzword, I guess, if you will, in the 80s and maybe even in the 70s. I don't remember exactly, but the SCS and the Congress together created the Resource Conservation and Development councils, I guess, what we call them.
RCD.
And I was we were in the Washita RC&D, I think is what we called it. And I was president of that twice. For some reason they reelected me after I'd been in for a while, but so we did a good deal of work there. We did, we could get funding then for roadside erosion work and a lot of things that were more rural development than necessarily conservation. And I thought RC&D was really, and still do think it was really a good way for USDA to be involved in rural development. But some of the members of Congress weren't real pleased with the RC&D, and the RC&Ds were really controlled, if you will, by the conservation districts. The people that were on the RC&D boards came from conservation districts, and so there was an effort when Glenn English was House chairman of the House Ag Committee. The Congress started the Rural Development Administration, RDA is what they call it, I think. And I went to Washington and tried to lobby for RC&D. I said, why do you want to create another agency that does the same thing that RC&Ds can do? But I think the problem was, and I'll be somewhat critical of some of our conservation districts, they didn't have the vision, I don't think, that they needed to expand out into rural development. And so the RC&Ds were somewhat hamstrung, I think, by their makeup. And that's why I think they organized the Rural Development Administration. And I still think if the districts would have stepped up to the plate and done the right thing, we could have maybe done a better job than rural development has, but that's my opinion, so for what that's worth. But
do you recall who the district conservationist was when you first who approached you to start?
I don't remember his name.
Of those 32 years, was there quite a turnover in the board, or did you have a lot of the same members?
There was quite a turnover. Before the end of the 32, I was the only one that had been on that long. Most of the guys had either gotten off or retired or something. Mm-hmm. And I'll be a little bit critical of conservation district boards. During that 32 years, I saw a number of people get on our board and other boards for what they could get out of it and not what they could do for the country and the community. And that was always kind of a disappointment to me, but I kind of emerged as a leader at the state and national level, and so they kind of would listen to what I had to say a lot of times, and I'd always bring them up to date on current events, what had happened in this month at both levels. But and I those people were good people, but their motives I thought were not in the right place. They needed to be there to serve the people in the district and the county, and not themselves necessarily. But that's human nature. That's the way people are. So
you saw the transition from pre-Farm Bill days to post-Farm Bill days when Farm Bill programs came in. What do you see what happened during that transition before and after that?
Well, I kind of wanted to get into that in this way, and of course I was on the board in the 70s, and in 1980 there was a fellow elected president of the United States that had a kind of a different vision for the way this country ought to be taken, I think, and there was a number of changes, not necessarily in conservation, but in the way this country operated. And in 1982, there was a freshman class of House members that were, I'll call them oligarchs, if you will, or people that were from families that had money. And up to that point, those people had pretty much stayed out of politics. But they had a different view of the way things ought to be operated. So the Farm Bill was enacted every 5 years at the time, and ironically, in some of those changes that came about, I think conservation came out better than a lot of other parts of the government did. The 85 Farm Bill was the first one that I was actually involved in, and that was the first bill that actually had a conservation title in it. Up to then, NRCS or SCS had just operated as a, through the conservation district since the 30s as a federal agency to work with private landowners on their own land, but they were not seen, and there's still no intention of them to be a regulator. They operate with landowners in a voluntary basis, But there was a number of programs that they had developed over the years that farmers were able to use, and one of the things that this new breed of congressman wanted to do was rather than just have a program do one practice on a farm, they wanted to have a whole farm plan, what they called it, which makes sense on paper, but sometimes in practical terms it don't necessarily. But I said that to say that in the '85 Farm Bill, conservation was finally recognized as a title in the bill, and that was a win, I think, for conservation. And then in the '90 bill, in the '95 Farm Bill, there were debates, and there was an effort to consolidate programs in the federal government, and there was a big push. If you remember on National Public Television, there was a whole series of programs aired that talked about the government, and it was too big and it had too many employees, and the comments about USDA was that USDA had one employee for every farmer in the country and that sort of thing. So there was a big debate about that, and a big hearing, and I don't know if you've ever seen any of those videos, but the day that the House Ag Committee actually considered that consolidation, I was in that committee room, and it was standing room only, and they panned around, and I was standing at the back wall, so you can see me in there on that video if you've ever seen it. It was on National Public Television. But as a result of that, there were a lot of consolidation of programs. But again, NRC or conservation won because we created the EQIP program, and we got $1.2 billion authorized for conservation in that bill, and that was way more money than had ever been authorized for conservation work in the United States. Now, the appropriators didn't always follow through, and we didn't get that much money, but we had that much authority. So I think conservation came out ahead again in that debate. And that was during the time that I was an officer at Nacd, and so that was one of the proudest moments we had, I guess, of creating that much more funding for conservation on private lands through volunteer efforts in this country.
Was that why you were invited to be in the room, or because of your role as president?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And I spent a good bit of time in Washington, D.C. during those years. And
as the national president or as the Oklahoma president?
Well, both. First
Okay.
as Oklahoma president, and then as the national. And I was an officer. The National Association has an officer team. And I started as second vice president, and then first vice president, and then finally became president. So I was there in the officer team for 6 years. But I had been involved in working with the Congress before that, even, so.
About what years were you in that officer team? Was it with respect to the Farm Bill? Was it after the Farm Bill had been established when you came on the officer team? After the '85 Farm Bill?
In the officer team, yeah, after. Yeah.
After the '85 Farm Bill?
Yeah. Yeah. It was 90 something.
When you were
when I got to be an officer. But see, I was on the council. NACD had they call it a board of directors now, but at that time they called it the council. And each state provided delegates to that council. And I was Oklahoma's delegate for 5 or 6 years, or maybe more than that, before I actually ran for office and was, got into the leadership position. But and during that time was when I was working with Congress. I remember when Glenn English left to take the job at the Rural Electric Co-ops, Frank Lucas was elected to replace him in a kind of a midterm special election. And of course, I don't live in Frank Lucas's district, but I was in the same hearing room the day Frank Lucas was sworn in to the committee as a member of the House Ag Committee, which is what he really wanted to do when he went in. And that kind of brings us to another issue, and that's the Watershed Program. And so we started working, to go back, the agency over the years in the 70s and maybe early 80s had, it seemed to us, had kind of, the support for the Watershed Program had kind of eroded away. And we saw that in the states that had the Watershed Program as being a problem. And so we decided, well, we ought to have a national meeting somewhere, and we ought to invite people from those states that are interested in the Watershed Program and just see how much grassroots support there was for that program, because the agency had been telling us, well, the grassroots support's gone away. There's no real support for the Watershed Program anymore. So Oklahoma, being a leader in the Watershed Program, and historically we had built more structures than any other state, we decided, Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts decided to host that national meeting, and we did that in Oklahoma City. And there were a number of people. It was a well-attended conference, and we didn't know how many would show up, to be honest with you. We didn't know if the agency was telling us the truth, the grassroots support had gone away or had waned or what. But that conference proved them wrong, that there was still a lot of support for the program. So the fellow that was at SCS at the time, that was the head of that program, basically came to that meeting and said, we're going to close the program out. In so many words, that's basically what he said. So not too long after that, NACD had a meeting in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we went over to that meeting, and some of us that were interested in the Watershed Program decided that we ought to try to do something about that. So we went into a broom closet and we decided that we were going to form the National Watershed Coalition. And so not long after that, Bob Rasky was the regional representative for NACD in the western states, and his office was in Denver, Colorado. So Bob was real interested. He'd worked for SCS in his past career and then retired and came to work, and he was real interested in the Watershed Program. And so the leadership at NACD said, well, Bob ought to be involved in this. So we went, several of us, a few of us, 2 or 3 of us from Oklahoma and some other states, went to Denver, and we got together and had a meeting, and we decided we were going to organize an organization, and we call it the National Watershed Coalition. And I was one of the signatures on that organization chart, and the coalition is still in business and still working, and we have kept the program alive. In 1993, when the floods came on the upper Mississippi and the Missouri River, there was so much damage there, flood damage, that the agency and members of Congress came to the Watershed Program and said, can we have your funding this year to help mitigate that flood damage in the Midwest? And we said, sure. And that was a mistake because they never restored the funding to us at the level that it was before that. And we didn't know that that was what they were aiming at, and I'm not sure that they did at the time, but they figured out that once they got the funding away from us, they didn't necessarily have to give it back to us. So we were pretty disappointed in that. But so since then, we've worked to try to shore up funding for the Watershed Program, and I'm hearing this year that there's going to be money available now that we haven't seen in the past for this program. So we'll see what the Congress does. If they can ever agree on anything, hopefully it'll be conservation. I told people over the years that the one place in the Congress where partisanship didn't really muck things up was in the ag committees. The ag committees, both parties seem to work together there and try to do the right thing for agriculture and for conservation, and I think they still do. They don't make the news every day, which is probably a good thing, but I think there is less partisanship in those committees than there is in most of the other parts of the Congress. But not long after we organized the Watershed Coalition, we started to recognize that there was some problems with some of our structures, and some of them had the dam safety issue came up, and there had been facilities and subdivisions and nursing homes and hospitals and things built below some of our structures in the development, and our structures didn't meet dam safety standards. So we decided, well, we need to start doing something about that. So we started and got some rehabilitation language in a bill, and Frank Lucas championed that for us. And after working for a number of years and months on that issue, I was working over by Heavener one day, and my phone rang, and it was Frank, and he said, "We just got the bill passed on the watershed rehabilitation." And I told him, I said, "Frank, I'm going to tell the guys that the country boy went to town and got something done." So, but anyway, now there's money to rehabilitate watershed structures and bring them up to dam safety standards, and more money for maintenance on the structures, and to cut trees and keep those dams viable. And a number of years, when the program first started, it was Public Law 534, and then it was renumbered Public Law 566, but it really just built structures on the dams for flood control. And there's a provision in there that if a city or a county or someone needs storage for municipal water, they can pay to have that dam built higher and store more water. And but those dams have a design life, and the design life is based on an estimate of how long it will take that structure to silt in so that it doesn't hold any water. And we've actually had some of them do that. And this was before my time in that program, in probably the 50s when this happened, but there was an effort, and again led by some people in Oklahoma, to create a program and provide money for land treatment above some of those structures to keep the erosion down and the sediment from, and make those structures last longer. And so that was another win, I think, for conservation in that program. So, I'm still as passionate about conservation as I ever was. I currently serve as the president of the Nacd President's Association, and when you say that, people think, well, that's the past presidents of NACD, but that's an organization of past state and territory presidents that, and there's a number of us still alive. And they were organized a number of years ago to, as an affiliate of NACD, to basically provide some level of mentorship, if you will, or advice, or to be called upon if needed for past experiences and some of that. And so the President's Association has done a number of projects, and I probably don't remember them all, but I know one that we did, we contracted with an author to write a history of NACD, and this was back in the 60s, and the title of that book is For Love of the Land. And then when I became president of NACD, I went back to that same fellow and I said, would you be interested in bringing the history up to date for the last 20 years or how long it had been? And he did that, and the President's Association in both cases were able to raise the money to pay him, and then in our SCS in the first book, they had money to have a bunch of those published, and they put one in every field office in the country. Now, the second edition, the mood had changed in the Congress, and we didn't get that many published, but the second one is called With One Voice, and it was written while I was president of NACD. And I actually wrote the foreword to that book, and in that foreword I talked about conservation districts and the unique position they have if they're willing to step up and be leaders in this country in the conservation area, and that might, in recent times, that includes environmental and climate change and global warming and water quality and a whole gamut of things rather than just soil erosion, which was what it was when it started. And so I still think conservation districts, if they'll step up and take a leadership role, are in a unique position to make a lot of difference. And I can tell you from personal experience, the members of Congress really do listen to conservation district directors. The unfortunate thing is most conservation district directors don't know that. They just go to their meetings and they deal with the day-to-day stuff, and they don't really have a vision for what it can be like on out in the future. And they can look back at the history and see how much from the Dust Bowl to now, how much influence they've had, but for some reason it's hard for them to vision what it can be like 50 or 75 years from now.
And how do you fix that?
I don't know. I wrote it in the book. I said, do it. But will they do it? Will they read the book? I don't know.
I keep thinking your deal with your involvement with the Water Coalition goes back to you having to pump water to do your hogs. The value of water was
The
important.
value of water
Was
absolutely.
important at that point.
And water quality is an issue too,
Yeah.
not just quantity, but quality.
Yeah. Back to that.
We have, and this is probably one of my biggest disappointments is in the area where I live, in the creek that actually runs across my ranch is a floodplain. And for starting in the 50s or early 60s, there was an effort to build a flood control project on that creek. And my dad was involved in that, and several of the people in the community, and they actually developed a plan. And the commission actually did some survey work on some structures, but it's never been funded. So that's kind of one of my disappointments that we didn't get that.
Was it Sandboys?
Sandboy, yeah. So when I went on the board, I had a vision that we could make that happen, but we never got it done.
How many watershed projects did you have in your district?
None.
Not in there yourself?
Yeah.
Have several around you surrounding that district?
Yeah, Latimer County, LaFleur County, Pittsburgh County. They built a structure in Pittsburgh County a couple of years ago, and they're still working on that Peaceable.
Doc Coker's.
Peaceable Creek, or
Brush Peaceable.
Brushy Peaceable, that's what I was trying to
Doc
think.
Coker's.
Yeah. And then the Caston Mountain project over on, and I can remember, of course, my family was from Worcester, but both my dad and my mother's family was from there. And I remember that Mountain Creek used to flood Worcester, the town of Worcester. And I remember one year my aunt and uncle had a house there and kind of at the west side of town, and the flood got up so big that it actually turned their house on the foundation a little bit, so they had to get it straightened back up. And not long after that, they built those structures, and now the town don't flood anymore. So those are just some things that you remember. And
Well, what are some of the other issues in Haskell County that you had to deal with when you were director?
Our county was in the 30s, and before World War II. Actually, World War II changed the dynamic of agriculture and actually this whole country. We went from an agrarian society to an industrial society. You studied that in history, but and this kind of goes back to the Grapes of Wrath and that story about the people that left here and went to California. Our county had been farmed for crops up until mid 30s or early 40s, and then the people just left and abandoned the land, and there wasn't any vegetation, anything on it that was of value, and so the weeds came and that sort of thing. So our emphasis in our district was to do like I did when I said I bought my place and I improved the pastures. Our emphasis was on improving grazing, because we didn't have a lot of cropland in the county. And then when the Arkansas River navigation system came in, it flooded all the cropland that we did have. So we're primarily grass, pasture land in my county. So the district's emphasis has been to take that old, worn out cropland and convert it to pasture land by, improved varieties and introduced varieties of grasses and proper fertilization. And in the past 20 years or so, we've seen a lot of poultry producers in the county, and we've tried to do and have. We had at one time, and I think it may be still that way, I haven't been on the board for 10 years or so I'm not completely in, but every poultry and swine producer in our district had a waste management plan and had all the facilities that they needed to carry that plan out. And we had cost shared with them to, not only with the technical assistance to develop the plan, but cost shared with the facilities they needed to manage their waste, their animal waste. And not only for water quality, but the animal waste was used for soil amendments, to improve grazing land and that sort of thing. So that was really our emphasis in my county, and still is.
Any issues with feral hogs?
Feral hogs are, in my part of the state, not as big an issue as they are in the western part of the state.
Okay.
We kind of like to hunt them ourselves. My grandson's got a whole pen full of hog dogs, he calls them, and they, they like to hunt those hogs. And you get out in the crop country and they hate them. And so there's a debate in Oklahoma, and several years ago, when Mary Fallon was governor, the state vet, and I can't remember his name, I think he still is the state vet, they'd let us trap those hogs, and we'd take them to the local auction barn, and a lot of the the Hmong people and the Far Eastern people that were living in the area, and a lot of them in the poultry business, would buy those hogs, and you know, they had a buyer, and he'd buy every hog you could take in there. And so I set some traps up in my place, and I had 2 young grandsons, and we'd catch a load of hogs, and we'd take them to the sale and sell them, and I'd give the boys the money, you know. And so that when Mary Fallon got to be governor and the state vet, they decided to outlaw the sale of wild hogs, and so you can't transport them or you can't sell them in the auction barns. So I called him up and I said, you know, what you're going to do is going to make the hog problem a lot worse. And he said, well, I can't help it. He said, we're under a lot of political pressure to do something, and said, we don't know what to do. And he said, we think wild hogs have pseudo-rabies. And I said, well, do you have any evidence of that? No, we don't have any evidence of that. I said, well, you know, the way wild animals in the wild work is one of them gets sick, they die. And that takes care of the disease. They don't, you know, they don't perpetuate disease like domestic animals do. He understood that, but he still had to do something to appease the political whatever. And what I told him was true, and he knew it was true when he did it. The hogs are worse now than they were then. There's no way to get rid of them. And of course, the Noble Foundation has developed a trap, and you know, it works automatically, and hopefully you can get a bunch of hogs in there, and all you can do is kill them, or they fly with helicopters and kill them. I said, well, what are you going to do with those dead carcasses once you kill them? Well, they didn't know, they didn't have an answer for that either. So, you know, you're going to have 50 hogs out there in my pasture dead. I'm not sure that's very healthy either. So feral hogs is an issue that has been made worse by the politicians. I'll just say it that way.
So that fellow that bought all those hogs at the auction, what did he do with them?
Those people would eat them. They'd take them and
They butcher them?
butcher them and eat them. Yeah.
Have you ever eaten one of those?
Yeah. Actually, I've had heart surgery, and I had 5 cardiac bypasses and had cancer surgery. But my heart doctor don't want me to eat saturated fat meat. But wild hogs are on the menu.
Pretty lean.
Yeah. You got to be careful. You don't want to eat one that's diseased or, you know. But they're good. Deer's good. Elk, squirrels, fish. I can eat all that stuff, but I can't eat beef or pork that's been fattened on corn.
Or put your butter on a potato, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, when you first bought the property, when you came back to Kent and bought your property and connected with the conservation person to help you, how did you know to do that? Do you remember?
Well, of course, I told you I'd been in FFA and then in the Young Farmers, and I'm not sure what they teach in FF or BOAG class anymore, but back then, my BOAG teacher was a World War II vet, and he'd come out of the war and went to OSU and got his degree and came to Kenna. That was his first place to teach, and he taught there until he retired, 40-something years. And he taught us boys about things like conservation and conservation districts, and told a lot of war stories, and was almost like a second dad to most of us, you know.
What was his name?
James Perryman.
Okay.
And he had grown up in western Arkansas, and then went into the military, and I guess he was at Altus somewhere, and he was in the Army Air Corps. But he married a woman from out around the Altus area, and how they wound up in Kenna. I think when he graduated from OSU, Kenna needed an ag teacher, And then they said, there's a job, and he went and took it. And,
Well, was FFA also the place you learned how to do public speaking so that you could?
that and of course I took speech class in college too. And but we need to talk about the college part of it a little bit. I told you I graduated at Eastern, then went to OSU to enroll, and then Vietnam got in the way. When I came back out of the military, of course I was married, and we had our first daughter was married or was born in March after we moved over there in November. So wife was pregnant when we moved. And of course we had borrowed the money to buy that land, and I didn't see how I could afford to go to Stillwater and finish 2 more years of college. But I did go back to Eastern and took another year, 2 more semesters, primarily of math courses and science courses and things like that, which didn't really get me any closer to a bachelor's degree, but it gave me more, I think, a little broader understanding, and you know, I think it helped. And like I say, I wanted to be a surveyor, and I was working as a surveyor when I came out. And in Oklahoma, before I went in to the military, there was no board or no license for surveyors or engineers. During the time that I was in Southeast Asia, they created the State Board of Licensure for surveyors and engineers, and started licensing surveyors and engineers. And when I came home, I applied under the grandfather clause. The Constitution has a grandfather clause which says if you're making a living in this profession and the state decides to regulate it, they have to give you a license. So I applied under the grandfather clause. Well, they had a rule from April of one year to April of the next year. You had to be surveying full time during that year. Well, about half of that time I was in Southeast Asia. And so they turned me down on my grandfather clause. And I thought, well, that's not right. So I went and talked to the guy I was working for, and I said, I don't think the board ought to do me that way. I think they ought to go ahead and give me a license. He said, I'll just go take the test. So he wasn't any help at all. So I went and took the test and got my license as a land surveyor and worked for them for a long time. I've actually worked for them over 50 years, but off and on. I moved back to Eastern Oklahoma, and there'd be times when the energy business would be kind of like it is now. There wouldn't be much going on, and I worked at other jobs, and of course had the ranch and the cattle and everything. But the moral of that story is I never got to go back to OSU and get my degree. And but I got my license, and I'm still working. I worked yesterday. I'd be working today if I weren't here. So I've got a boy that works for me, and he's got the COVID right now, so I'm working by myself right now. But anyway, we're making it. And
I understand there's less and less land surveyors.
There's less and less land surveyors, less and less land attorneys that really understand title work. It's getting to be a struggle to get title work done.
I'd say it's changed quite a bit from the time you were 13 going out with that guy to what you do today.
What can you say about the technology change from the time you started surveying to today? That had to be
when he came over there, and I know you'll know what a Gurley transit is. It was just an instrument that sat on a tripod and had a plumb bob that hung on a string, and it measured angles. That's basically what it did. And we used a steel tape to measure. All the measurements were done with steel tape. So, and back then we drove cars, and the fellow that owned the company had a brother that had a Chevrolet dealership in Texas, so he bought all of his cars from him, and we usually used Chevrolet Biscaynes or whatever they were, and we had a girly transit and a tripod and a range pole. I know you know what that is. And then we had a alidade. You remember alidade that we used to run elevations with, and a plane table and that was the extent of the equipment we had, you know. And then a number of years later, they came out with the theodolites, and the Wheel Company out of England really was the first one to hit the market with those, and he bought a number of those, and those were much more accurate, and they had internal scales, and they were lighter weight, and they had optical plummets, and so that was a vast improvement on what we'd had, but we still used a steel tape to measure with. And then a few years after that, they came out with electronic distance measuring, which used infrared light and a prism, you know, and you could actually measure distance without having to pull a tape. And that was another big improvement. And then the military launched some satellites and started developing the global positioning system, and they did that, and finally there was enough pressure on them to issue a couple of frequencies that could be used by the public, and now there's 3 that we can use, and so we've transitioned to global positioning system, which is completely different than the way it was when I started. But in a couple of months, I'll be 75 years old, and if I still had to do it the old way, I probably wouldn't still be working, to be honest with you. Yeah. But the global positioning system, and there's been a number of improvements in that. The interesting thing about GPS is it basically does one thing. It gives you a position on the surface of the earth within about 10 meters. And that's probably not good enough for your lot in town. So the Corps of Engineers and the NGS, it's called now, and some of the federal agencies got busy and had some fairly smart people to figure out how to do what they call RTK, which is real-time kinematic, and they developed that. And one of the projects that that they used during the development of RTK was on the navigation systems. The Corps of Engineers set monuments along the navigation channels to monitor the channel and the silt, and you know, so they could keep it clean so that barges could move. And we had one of the contracts in Oklahoma to set those monuments along the Arkansas River Navigation Channel, which we did. And they weren't setting them for the purpose of developing RTK, but it turned out that they were a real integral part of the development of RTK. And so now I carry about $60,000-$70,000 worth of equipment in my truck, and but it makes my job easier. And,
but you said yesterday you were out surveying by yourself. When you first started, how big was the survey crew typically that you worked with?
Well, the work that I did primarily was in the energy business, and we usually had 3 people on a crew if we were just doing well locations. If we had pipelines, sometimes we had 5.
Very many women?
Not then.
Not then.
There are now. There are some women surveying now, but not then. There weren't too many. We had one woman that worked in the company, and she really worked in the office and did calculations and that sort of thing. And she actually wound up was the first woman in the state of Oklahoma to get her license to survey. She passed away a couple of years ago, but there are some women. I know there's one that works for ODOT, Oklahoma Department of Transportation, at the McAllister area, where they do what they call location surveys, which is a lot about the same thing I do. They work section boundaries and that sort of thing for a project, you know, I know her, she works over there. She's, I don't know, 30 years old, I guess, something like that.
I think, is that Kristen Campbell? Or do you know her name?
I don't remember her name.
Okay.
That may be. Maybe.
I'm thinking with your surveying, it ties in pretty good with your conservation. You could be out on the land and think, this needs fixed.
Yeah.
Or they're not doing this right. Or
Do you still tie into some of those original old surveys that you were talking about back in the original
Oh, yeah.
days?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
some of those back in the early 1900s.
Yeah, 1890s.
So
Yeah.
you find some of the original monuments?
Yeah.
that's pretty cool.
Sure do. Especially where I live. See, in the Oklahoma Territory, the original surveys were done in like the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were some fraudulent surveys done and they repeated them in 20 years later or something like that. But in the Indian Territory, the Dawes Commission that I mentioned earlier that did that survey, they pretty much did it right to start with. They had by that time weeded out the fraudulent surveyors. And a lot of those guys that were deputy and U.S. surveyors had been in the Civil War as their officers. And they didn't have anything to do with them after the war was over, so they made surveyors out of them. And some of them were not quite as honest as they should have been, but they had, by that time, they'd weeded those guys out. See, the surveys weren't done in the Indian Territory until the 1890s. So they were.
Can you imagine doing that today, starting with just the native land out there? Surveying?
Well, I'd use RTK today, GPS, but it's amazing, and understanding the intricacies of what it takes to do a good survey, and to have everything fit. And of course, they had instructions, and they had to fit a certain standard, and but it's amazing how accurate they were, and they didn't have Gurley trenches. They had birch solar compasses and the chains. Chains were linked, 66 foot per chain. And
they don't have correction lines too often. You see a few.
There are correction lines because you can't put a flat map on a round surface. So you have to have adjustments, and they figured that out. By the time they got to the Indian Territory, they pretty much had that all down, how to do it. So some of the other states and some of the western Oklahoma part is not quite as well done as what was done where I live. But I still find a lot of those original.
Are there any of the older markers on your property?
Actually, there was one at the southwest corner of my property. And there had been a wagon road through there. And then the creek, Sandboy Creek, comes through there. And they didn't build a bridge, so they closed that road. And when I bought the land, there was no road there, just an old road bed. But that stone was still there. And when we had the ice storm, 10, 12 years ago, there was all kinds of debris down, and it clogged up the bridges and everything. So we used EWP money, NRCS EWP money, to hire contractors to go in there and clean all that up. And they had those skid steer machines and things like that they did that with. And lo and behold, they ran over my stone and knocked it out. Oh. Didn't know what it was. So I went back and set a steel monument with a brass cap on it in the place of that stone. And now the stone's in a flower bed in my front yard. But yeah, there was.
Would there be some marking on it?
Yes.
I mean,
mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about this to know.
There was a specific way laid out in the manual as to how they were marked. So you can look at one and tell where it is, what its location is.
Okay. And the one you do now, I've seen them on sidewalks. They're about.
Yeah.
And it has whoever did the surveying's name around that.
Well, that's the state board now requires us to put a cap, if you will, or one of those.
Kind of looks like a big washer, but
it's usually plastic. It could be aluminum, but it would have the number, and I use mostly 1/2-inch rebar is what I use, and I do have some cases I have to use a concrete nail or something like that, but I buy a plastic cap that's got my registration number on it so that they can tell who said it. That's just a requirement by the state board, and most states are requiring that now, so.
You know, without having any watershed structures within your district, how did you really latch on to become such a public spokesperson for the watershed program? And
Well, like I told you, the Sandboy watershed was important to me, and I always had hopes that we could actually someday build that. I still have a copy of that plan in my file cabinet, by the way.
I've got a copy in my office.
Yeah, and so probably never be built, but you never know. Land rights are getting to be a bigger issue than they were when we started that project.
Making it harder and harder to justify them.
But that probably was number one, and then just see the value of the program, and like where my aunt and uncle's house was almost washed away in Worcester, and see the damage, and people. There's a train of thought in this country by some people that don't understand that. Well, if you live in a floodplain, why don't you just move? Well, how can I do that? I mean, that's where my land is. I bought that, or I inherited it, or something. That's where my place is. I can't just up and move. It's not that simple. And so there's things that we can do. But in addition to that, look at how much money it saves county commissioners and highway departments on damages and less damages to structures and roads and bridges and people that are blocked when the river or the creek floods and can't get to the doctor or something like that. I mean, those things are important.
I just remember the testimony you've given in DC a number of times. You were really a good spokesperson where you really spoke from the heart and just stated the facts, that you had everybody's attention in there. There wasn't anything else going on in the room. You really had a talent to tell the story.
Well, I think that goes back to what I said about conservation district directors that came on the board for what they could get out of it and not what their real mission is, and that's to contribute to the community and the welfare, the country and the community, primarily their community they live in. You remember when we started the state-funded cost share program, in that first iteration of that bill, we prohibited local directors from using that fund on their own property. And I was pretty instrumental in getting that language in that bill. A lot of directors didn't like that. And then we had one director that wound up becoming a state senator, and he actually changed that language. So now, and that's okay. I mean, there may be a need in a conservation district directors, but my thought was the funding is not going to be nearly enough to address all the issues, and we ought to be doing that for the other people in the community instead of ourselves. I mean, we're not here to necessarily take care of ourselves.
And it also gave the program some credibility. That
I think it did, yeah.
For starting out.
So, I don't know, it's just, you do the right thing, and you tell the truth, and you don't embellish it. And now, I've not been in Congress for 15 years, so I'm not sure how that would work today, but.
Did you ever think about running for?
I ran for state representative twice, actually. The first time, we had a fellow that had some personal problems that was in the office, and I ran against him, and actually got more votes on election day than he did, but he got more absentees than I did, and there was a big FBI investigation, and nothing ever came of that. But then 2 years later when he ran, I filed again, but by that time he had decided he wasn't gonna run, and about 5 or 6 other people got in the race, and I should have just withdrawn, but I didn't win, so. But yeah, and I was on the school board at home for a while.
You stay busy. It's very, very civic minded. And
Well, I think that's important. A lot of people don't feel that way or just don't. I think they just don't think about it. I think that's one of the things that when I say about directors is they don't think about on out in the future what's happening. They just worry about what's today, and they don't really look back to history and see what has happened. And I think that's human nature. I think a lot of the population is that way. They just live today and don't worry about tomorrow and don't think about yesterday, and let's don't make that same mistake again. Let's talk about the COVID just a little bit before we quit.
yes, we need to. That's on my list right there.
In 1918, we had the flu epidemic in this country, and it was similar to the COVID now. And there were mask requirements, and a lot of people died. And we got through that, and you know what happened right after that was the Roaring Twenties. You remember hearing about the Roaring Twenties, when everybody felt like they could get out and do things, and that was kind of a culture change in the United States when that happened. But at the end of the Roaring Twenties in '29, we saw the market crash. And so then we struggled as a country for a while. But conservation won in that, because in '34 we started the Soil Erosion Service. That was in the mid-30s. So let's jump forward to today. We've got the COVID pandemic going right now. I think it's a different mood in this country, but even then there were people that resisted wearing masks, and they passed laws to require them. You could be arrested if you didn't. And now you know what kind of debate's going on about vaccinations and masks and all that stuff. And look at the mess that we're in this country with the division that we have. And I don't think we had that kind back in 1918. But every time that we've had something like the division that we have politically or whatever, there's been a catastrophic event happen that has changed everybody's attitude. In the 30s, it was World War II, because it started in the early 40s. And when World War II came along, the people in this country forgot about their differences, and they united, and they all had the same mindset, and we were all in this together. And since World War II, we haven't had a catastrophic event, and it's been so long that people have forgotten. So where does that take us in 2021? We have another pandemic. Is it going to take a catastrophic event to pull us out of this thing? And what will that event be? Will it be climate change? Probably, as I see it, that's probably the most likely thing. Mm-hmm. But climate change is real. It's here. And a lot of people don't recognize it yet. But people have to be slapped up beside the head, if you will, sometimes before they wake up and say, we need to do something about that. And in World War II, we need to do something about this. We don't want those foreign countries running our country. So what can we do to get people back working together? I don't know.
You're at least one or two things. Possibilities.
But I don't know what can happen, what will happen in the next 10 years or so. Mm-hmm. there's going to have to be something happen, or we're not going to have a country anymore. I think it's that serious. Most people don't agree with me, but that's where I am.
Well, you're a visionary, so that is expected.
You know, with all these stories and with all of the observations you've had during your lifetime and you've seen the transitions that, have you shared those stories with your kids and grandkids? And if you sit down with them, would they be able to talk
Probably
about
not as much as I should have, because it's hard to get their attention. I tell you what, I've been kicking around in my mind in the last few months is actually sitting down and finding the time to do it's going to be the challenge, and actually writing a book about kind of what I said here. And I think this video might be the start of something that they can look at and say, well, maybe they'll think about that. But where I came from, where my families came from in Alabama and Tennessee, and what brought them to Oklahoma, and what brought my mother and dad together, and just kind of the history of the family, but also how it related to the state and to the country. I've been thinking about writing a book, but I don't know if I've got it. I don't know if I've got what it takes or not.
You have a laptop, type a paragraph a day.
Oh,
or
I've got a
something.
laptop, and I've got a tablet, and I've got a computer, and I couldn't run my business anymore. You know, when
That's true. Yeah,
in the
that's true.
surveying business, when computers first came, you know, when people started getting them, I thought, well, I'll be retired. I'll never have to mess with a computer. I made it about a year. And I said, yeah, I've got to have a computer. I can't, you know, I can't operate without one. And there's so much stuff online that I can get those original field notes. You used to have to go to Muskogee. They've got them for the Indian Territory in a big vault in Muskogee. Finally, the original notes are in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for Oklahoma, because Oklahoma wasn't a state. So the surveys were done from Santa Fe, and that's where the records are stored still. But several years ago, our surveying society was able to get copies of those, and they are copies they're typewritten copies, but they're in Washington. And we were able to get copies of those and archive them in the library here in Oklahoma City, and they're available. We can,
online?
There's a company that puts them online. The library doesn't have the capability yet to put them online, but at least you could call up there and they could copy them and send them to you. And now there's a company that's in Illinois that actually has them online, so I can go online and get those notes. So if somebody calls in a job and I get home tonight, I don't have to wait until the courthouse opens or something. I can get on the computer and get what I need that night and be ready to go, you know. So I couldn't make it without a computer, is what I'm trying to say.
Do you think your kids and grandkids understand your involvement in DC and providing testimony at hearings?
I actually took two of my grandsons to DC one time, but they were little. They weren't, and they've not forgotten that. How much of an impression that made on them, I'm not sure. But they remember it, and they always will. My granddaughter never got to go, and I've often said I wish I ought to just take her now. She's married, but I still ought to take her and go up there sometime. But
that could be another chapter in your book.
Yeah.
I was going through my notes. I've got something here about you talked before a hearing with Senator Nichols about abandoned coal mine lands in Haskell County.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about.
Well, I didn't talk about the AML program. We, when that program started, of course it was federally funded, and the commission, there wasn't any state funds necessarily for it, but it was basically came through the Conservation Commission. But since it wasn't a state program, rather than have it in office, they contracted with Conservation District to do the payroll and basically the management of that with federal money. And my district was the first district that actually took that responsibility, and we did the secretarial work and the payroll and all that, but they didn't have benefits or anything. But they actually were housed in the commission office in Oklahoma City, but all their timesheets and everything came through our district. And we did that for 10 years or so, and then they moved it to another district just to kind of spread the work around, I guess, or something. But there is a lot of abandoned mine land in my county, and quite a bit of it on my ranch. And so we had to go through, and the program required us to prioritize based on health and safety. And a lot of it was safety. Deep strip mines up close to a public road where a car could run off in it or something, was priority one. And so we started working on those. And then some of the underground mines there were subsidence, and they would cave in schoolyards and places, in private land as well. And we'd sometimes be in the county road, and we'd contract with somebody to fill that in, and they're still doing that. They're still doing abandoned mine land work. We're not doing so much of it because we got a lot of it done in my county. All the priority ones are done. There's some priority 2 and 3s that may not ever get funded. But one of the challenges with the abandoned mine land program in the Surface Mine and Reclamation Act, there's a tax put on coal that went to that fund. And it was a pretty good sized fund. And Senator Byrd in West Virginia had a lot of coal miners, and they needed some funding for black lung insurance and that sort of thing. So he raided the abandoned mine land fund to pay for a lot of that insurance for people that had black lung and sort of like things like that. So that was we took a pretty good hit in that program right there. My argument was, and when I testified was, let's go ahead and fund this program and get this work done, because there is an end to that program. I mean, we're not creating any more abandoned mine land because the law prohibits that. But the old stuff that was done in the 40s and 50s, on my place was done in the early 50s, we could reclaim that and be done with it. We could do that, and then the coal miners objected to it because of the tax. And I told them, I said, let's go ahead and do it, get the work all done, and then you won't have to pay the tax anymore. We can repeal the tax. Well, Senator Byrd kind of threw a shoe in that process, but it's still a good program, and it's still working. And but that was kind of the gist of that is, let's make sure that we spend this money for what it was intended to be spent for, and get this work done, finish it, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore.
So you lost a few battles.
Yeah, well,
won a few, but lost.
I haven't lost it yet. They're still working on it.
Okay. It was strip mining too. Was part of the problem.
It usually, that it was strip mining was the big issue. We have in eastern Oklahoma a number of old abandoned underground mines, but they don't present the problem that the strip mines do. And so.
And then part of your county, it's Lake Eufaula and the Kerr Reservoir, so you get back to water there too.
Yeah, we get our drinking water out of Lake Eufaula. That's where our water plant is.
So another reason to be involved with
all ties together.
Water, doesn't it?
We have a rural water district that gets water from Eufaula.
And in 1989, you were the Oklahoma's Outstanding Conservation District Director. 1989. I got that. So, yay.
I told them, I said, that's your award, and you can give it to who you want to. So,
well, I had read that when they built the dam for the lake, that it did not please some people further downstream. They thought it caused more flooding than it helped.
Well, we had a real bad flood in Kenna, record flood, 5 years ago or something like that. And prior to that, I can't remember what year it was, in the early 60s, 63 or 4, somewhere in there, was the record flood. And there was marks put in businesses on the counters and on the walls of how high the water got. And that's basically what we used. We put in a rural sewer project in the town of Kenna several years ago. I was the inspector on that and the surveyor too, and we used those watermarks to set the tops of the manholes, to keep floodwater from running into the system. But 4 years ago, I guess, we had another flood that was a lot higher than that original flood, like 2 feet higher, and it really pretty much wiped the town out. And I mean, the convenience store just tore their building down and rebuilt. The post office we had to go to Quentin to get our mail for 6 months while they redid the post office. And a number of the houses that were damaged have not been, some of them just been torn down and they've not been restored. And so the flooding, but talking about the dams, the year before that flood happened, just upstream from the town on the creek that flooded, they had built a new bridge. ODOT had built a new bridge across that creek. Well, people said that bridge is what caused the flood. Well, how can a bridge cause a flood? But that's what people think. Mm-hmm. And how do you change them? I mean, there's no point in arguing with them. You just know better and go on, Mm-hmm. But the bridge had a bigger mouth in it than the original bridge did. How could a bridge cause a flood? But it's a new bridge, so it caused a flood. So that's the same way the dams.
That's the simplest answer, whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I read that you had mules. You raised mules.
Yeah.
Do you currently, or you used to?
Well, I've still got 3 mules. They're about like me. They're getting old.
Not too many mule farmers. I've not come across too
I
many
used to
mule
have quite a few horses and had some real good horses, but I don't have any horses now. My grandson he ropes, and he's got I don't know, 4 or 5 roping horses, like $10,000 horses, and then he's got a girlfriend that's probably got 10 head, and she's a barrel racer, and she was working her horses yesterday in the arena. I've got an arena there. When I had my heart surgery, I couldn't work for a year, so he was about 7 or 8 years old. My grandson was at the time, so maybe he was a little older than that. He's probably 12. But anyway, we built an arena that summer, he and I did, and so he could learn to rope, and taught him to rope, and he's been to Las Vegas and goes to some of the big ropings. They've got his numbers so high that he can't rope in any of the local ropings. They won't let him, with the amateurs, if you will. But he's got horses. I don't have any of my own horses, but I still have 3 mules, and got 2 donkeys, and I'm not sure what they're good for, but Carolyn feeds them every day. So.
I've heard they keep coyotes away from your cattle, but
well,
I don't know.
I've heard that too, but
I'm
not sure if that's true or not.
What do you use the mules for?
Well, mostly just to look at now. I have used, over the years, I have used them in my surveying work when it's in real rough terrain. Ride the mules, and actually the company had a company, more than a newsletter. It was kind of a little booklet that they did every 6 months or every year or something like that, and they did a story about me riding my mules and doing survey work, and one survey I did, there was a boundary line that went along the middle of a creek, and the water was about 2 or 3 feet deep, and so I got on my mule and I'd ride down to where the creek made a bend, and I'd stop and get a shot there, and then ride on down. And that way I didn't get my feet wet. But I haven't. Well, since I had my heart surgery, I haven't really ridden the mule very much. So
And yet another chapter for your book.
there you go.
Well, why a mule over a horse for that?
Well, a mule is safer than a horse in rough terrain. I always tell them, I said, a mule is going to take care of himself. You know, people get mad at me, but mules are smarter than horses. And a mule is going to take care of himself if it's in a rock pile or a steep mountain or, places. So if you can stay on the mule, you're going to be okay. Now, if you fall off, you're on your own. But if you stay on the mule's going to take care of himself. He's not really worried about you, but in taking care of himself, he'll take care of you, so he won't hurt you. And they're just hardy, and they're more sure-footed than horses in rough terrain. Now, they're not for rodeos and fast work and stuff like that. But
And you saddle them up like you do,
Of course, my dad had mules. That's kind of my granddad. My granddad hauled the Indians from Alabama to the Indian Territory with mules and wagons. So it's kind of in my blood, I guess.
That's that thread. The thread is there, isn't it? Anything else you want to ask?
No, but very interesting.
Anything else you want to say?
That's about all I can think of. I'll probably think of something on the way home that I wish I'd have said.
You probably will. I'll add it in. Well, my last question then is, how do you want history to remember you?
Well, as somebody that not only cared about his fellow man and the environment and the state and the country, but somebody that tried to actually do something about it, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I think
I hadn't thought about how I want history to remember me.
Think about it.
I'm not sure I have a lot to say about that, but I guess I can wish.
Well, at least there's a paper trail that shows you went to D.C. and that, things did happen.
Almost lived in D.C. for a long time.
And you're leaving the world a little bit better place than you found it.
I hope so. Somebody else will have to be the judge of that. When I became first vice president of Nacd, the organization was struggling. The membership was kind of divided, and there was a CEO that had been there a number of years, and there's more and more of the members that were becoming disgruntled with him, and he resigned, and we had to hire a new CEO when I was first vice president. So when I became president and the new CEO, and we were struggling financially because a lot of the districts had maybe not quit paying their quota, but had reduced the amount, our funding wasn't good, and we had some good projects with NRCS, and some of those had been cut back or eliminated. And so we decided that one of the things that we needed to do at the leadership of Nacd was public relations with our members. So I kind of took it on myself for that 2 years to go to every state in the union, to their state meeting, and just talk to them about Nacd and what it does. And it's a great organization. It has done lots of good things for this country. SCS and NRCS are federal agencies, and their heart's in the right place. But being government agencies, their hands are somewhat tied when it comes to getting up there in front of Congress and saying, we don't like what you're doing, we want you to do it this way. they have to basically toe the line on whoever's in the White House, if you will. So NACD can take up that slack, and we do a good job of it, and still today. And but in those times, it was really important, and we had so much change coming in the Farm Bill and the conservation title, and I mentioned that the first conservation title was in the '85 Farm Bill. I think in the '90, they got out of sequence. They had the '90, and then it was the '92, I believe. They skipped 2 years before they could get an agreement on it. In the '92 Farm Bill, I believe it was, they made conservation Title II in the Farm Bill. Title I is commodities, corn and soybeans and those sort of things, and it always will be. Corn's the strongest lobby in this country as far as agriculture is concerned, so they'll always be number one. But they made conservation number 2, and that was when I was on the officer team. So that's another success story. I think that's another time when conservation, and it is still Title II in the Farm Bill. So NACD is a good organization. It works for its members on a daily basis, and with whoever's in the White House or whoever's in control of the Congress. And even today with the division up there in the ag committees, which most of the conservation stuff is heard, there's still a lot of bipartisan work there that happens. And NACD is a nonpartisan organization, and so we try to stay out of politics as much as we can, but we still need to go and we have 3,000 conservation district members and 17,000 district officials in this country. And as I said a while ago, the Congress wants to know what we think. They want to know what we think. And if we'll use that, as I wrote in the foreword of that book, if we'll use that, there's really no limit to what we can accomplish in this country. And I think that's proven even in this stimulus bill that we just saw passed. Conservation came out in good shape. There was more money put into that than had been in the past in some of the conservation programs. And that don't make the nightly news. And maybe that's a good thing.
I mean, that's your water and your food and your air. It's all of that. So.
But what happens if, when we had that ice storm, the grocery store within less than 24 hours didn't have a loaf of bread left. They didn't have any milk left. We have enough food on the shelves of our stores to last us about 24 or 36 hours. And if that quits coming, what are we going to do? People used to could grow a garden and grow their own hogs and stuff like that. They don't have that skill anymore. So it makes you just don't want to think about it, I guess, what could happen.
Let's try to encourage the next generation to keep up the good fight.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you took FFA, and I'm glad that person showed up on your father's doorstep to get you into land surveying. I mean, that seemed to be that was one of the key moments, signature moments in your life. So.
It was.
Well, thank you for sharing with us today. It's been great.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to it ever since Larry called me, wondering what I was going to say.
You did great.